A packet of secrets crossed a table in Washington, and somewhere far beyond the Potomac, men who had trusted America began walking toward their deaths without knowing it. In that quiet exchange, with no gunshot and no siren, one man came dangerously close to shattering the inner machinery of American intelligence. Welcome back, listeners. Today, we delve into the shadows to uncover the story of Aldrich Hazen Ames, the CIA mole who nearly broke American intelligence. A man who did not charge through history like a conqueror, but slipped into it like a stain. His betrayal did not simply hand secrets to Moscow. It poisoned trust, gutted networks, silenced brave human sources, and left the United States staring into the terrible possibility that its own house had been opened from the inside. To understand Ames, you have to return to the suffocating atmosphere of the Cold War, when suspicion had become a climate of its own. In those decades, especially from the 1960s into the 1980s, Washington and Moscow existed in a condition that was not quite peace and not quite war. It was a long, grinding duel of nerves. Empires did not merely count missiles. They counted whispers. They measured loyalty. They hunted hesitation in the eyes of diplomats and military officers. In Langley, Virginia, at CIA headquarters, and across the river in the offices of the FBI, the struggle was not only about policy or ideology. It was about the invisible men and women who lived under false names, passed rolled film in dead drops, and vanished into the winter streets after meetings that could cost them everything. By the early 1980s, this struggle had become even more brittle. The Soviet Union still looked formidable from the outside, but the internal decay was already there, hidden beneath ceremony, parades, and granite certainty. The KGB remained feared, disciplined, and immensely dangerous. The GRU, Soviet military intelligence, watched from its own corridors of secrecy. In Washington, officers who worked Soviet targets understood something ordinary citizens could only guess at. One well-placed source in Moscow could alter the strategic balance of whole continents. One betrayal could destroy years of patient work in a single week. And there was another pressure. The Cold War had produced a strange professional caste. Men and women who had spent their adult lives learning to think in masks. They drank too much. They lied for a living. They trusted almost no one completely, not even colleagues. A successful intelligence officer needed memory, nerve, and a kind of emotional compartmentalization that would look almost pathological in any ordinary life. Yet the bureaucracy surrounding them was still human. Offices had rivalries. Promotions mattered. Resentments festered. Failures were hidden. Vanity remained alive even in the most secret rooms in America. That is where Aldrich Ames belonged. Not in the mythology of espionage, not in the glamorous silhouette of the master spy, but in the deeply human, deeply dangerous world of mediocrity, grievance, appetite, and access. Aldrich Hazen Ames was born in 1941. And in a sense, he grew up around the edges of the clandestine world before he ever formally entered it. His father had worked for the CIA, and that mattered. Some men enter intelligence because of conviction, others because of ambition. For Ames, the world of secrets had the familiarity of old furniture. It was there early. It smelled normal. The bizarre became routine before he was old enough to grasp its moral weight. He joined the CIA in 1962, first in low-level work, then more seriously as the years passed. By 1969, he had become a case officer. That progression might sound inevitable when reduced to a line in a biography, but nothing about Ames was inevitable, except perhaps his talent for appearing more substantial than he really was. He was not without intelligence. That would be too simple and too comforting. Institutions are rarely destroyed by fools alone. Ames could be perceptive, articulate, and capable of handling the bureaucratic and interpersonal complexities of intelligence work. But there was also something unfinished in him, something slack. He drank heavily. He could be careless. He often seemed to carry his disappointments like unpaid debts, resentments wrapped in irony. He served in places that mattered. He spent time in Ankara in the early 1970s. Later, he worked in New York. By the early 1980s, he was in Mexico City, one of the great crossroads of Cold War espionage, where diplomats, intelligence, officers, businessmen, and opportunists all moved through the same bright air under different pretenses. Mexico City could feel alive and loose on the surface, but intelligence officers knew what it was underneath. It was a city of listening posts, back-channel meetings, seductions, and professional embarrassment. Careers could rise there. They could also quietly rot. Ames was not a man built for inward discipline. This mattered more than any posting. Espionage history is full of ideological fanatics, patriots, adventurers, and double agents with tortured consciences. Ames was something more banal, and perhaps more frightening. He was weak in the ordinary ways that institutions often underestimate. He wanted more money. He wanted status. He wanted relief from humiliation. He wanted, above all, to escape the feeling that life had somehow cheated him. There is something chilling in that. The great breaches of history are often explained through grand motives: revenge, belief, treason born of political conviction. But sometimes, a state is wounded by a man who simply decides that his private discomfort matters more than the lives of strangers. By 1983, Ames had been transferred back to CIA headquarters and placed in the Soviet and East European sphere, eventually in the counterintelligence environment surrounding operations against the KGB and the GRU. Listeners, let that settle for a moment. He was not standing on the margins of the game. He was moving toward its center. In Washington, in offices lit by routine fluorescent light, with memoranda on desks and security badges clipped to jackets, Ames was gaining access to exactly the kind of information that no traitor should ever have held. This was the final ingredient: access without character, discontent without restraint. And his personal life was fraying as well. Debt pressed on him. Alcohol had become less a vice than a weather system. His marriage deteriorated. He began a relationship with Rosario Casas Dupuy, a Colombian woman whose tastes and expectations intensified his already worsening financial pressure. The details matter because espionage rarely erupts from abstraction. It grows in concrete rooms: bills, affairs, shame. The sensation of living below the life one believes one deserves. Ames later tried, in different ways, to rationalize what he did. Men like him often do. They search for language that makes betrayal sound like an unfortunate drift instead of a deliberate crossing. But April 1985 was not drift. It was choice. In April 1985, he volunteered himself to the Soviets. The moment itself was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. No lightning, no urgent music, just a CIA officer making contact with Soviet intelligence while assigned responsibilities that gave him extraordinary insight into American penetrations of the Soviet system. That is what makes it terrifying. A nation's worst injuries often begin in paperwork, in protocol, in the assumption that a cleared man in a suit remains what he appears to be. He approached the Soviet side in Washington and offered names. Not rumors, not policy gossip. Names. Human beings. Sources. Penetrations. The breathing architecture of American and Allied intelligence inside the Soviet world. In return, he asked for money, and the KGB understood immediately what had arrived at its door. There are moments in intelligence history when one side must feel, however briefly, the intoxicating sensation of impossible luck. A hostile service can spend years trying to recruit a clerk and never even touch a senior officer with real visibility. Then, suddenly, in the spring of 1985, a CIA insider with access to some of the most sensitive operations against the Soviet Union walks in under his own power. The KGB did not need to create Aldrich Ames. They only needed to recognize him. In those first exchanges, Ames gave them enough to prove his value. And once he crossed that line, the logic of survival changed. This is one of the black truths of espionage. A spy who betrays once can tell himself it was temporary. A spy who betrays twice begins to understand he is now trapped by his own continuation. To stop is dangerous. To continue is damnation. Many choose continuation because the first betrayal creates a new fear. The fear that, if they do not keep feeding the machine, it may turn and examine how it was fed. The KGB paid him handsomely, vastly beyond his government salary. The money did not come as some abstract promise. It materialized into a better house, expensive clothing, luxury purchases, and the sort of lifestyle that should have caused immediate alarm in any disciplined counterintelligence culture. But institutions are not only made of procedures. They are made of habits of looking, and too many people around Ames failed to look hard enough, soon enough. Meanwhile, in Moscow and across the Soviet sphere, the consequences began moving faster than the Americans understood. This is the point in the story where the air becomes difficult to breathe. Because what Ames sold was not simply information. It was time, initiative, warning, and confidence. Human sources who had risked everything to help the United States suddenly began disappearing, being recalled, being arrested, or going silent. Some were executed. Others vanished into the sealed machinery of Soviet punishment. Years later, institutions would still struggle to fully count the human cost. Because once a source is lost under a police state, certainty dies with him. Think of the men on the other side, a source inside the Soviet military establishment, a penetration near the KGB, an official who had spent years copying fragments, passing schedules, memorizing code words, walking into dead-drop sites with his pulse tearing through his chest. Such men did not imagine death as an abstraction. They knew what the Soviet state could do. The interrogation rooms, the exhaustion, the staged kindness followed by pressure, the accusation that your family would share your fate. And still, they had chosen to help. They trusted that the Americans would protect them with the highest seriousness of tradecraft. Then one day, because a man in Washington wanted money and relief from his own failures, the map of danger around them changed. Little did they know that the threat was not a surveillance camera missed on a snowy street, not a bungled brush pass, not a careless radio transmission. It was a CIA officer with a whiskey habit and an appetite for more. 1985 became a year of unraveling. One of the most consequential events of that year was the defection of Vitaly Yurchenko, a high-ranking KGB officer who came over to the West through Rome in August 1985. For American intelligence, this should have been a moment of extraordinary opportunity. Rome, with its old facades and layered shadows, had long been one of the great stages of Cold War intrigue. But Ames had access to the reporting that came from Yurchenko, and the betrayal already underway meant that the Soviets could shape their response with alarming confidence. Yurchenko would later return to the Soviet Union, and the whole episode deepened the fog, confusion, and paranoia inside the American system. What made the damage from Ames so devastating was not only the quantity of compromised material, it was the type. He had visibility into the most sensitive compartment of the struggle, the hidden relationship between American case officers and Soviet assets. That meant he could identify exactly which losses mattered, exactly which channels should have been preserved, exactly which names would do the maximum damage. This was not a hammer smashing blindly at glass. It was a scalpel in the hands of betrayal. And as the losses mounted in the late 1980s, the CIA began to sense that something was terribly wrong. But institutions under stress often search first for explanations that preserve their pride. Perhaps communications had been intercepted. Perhaps the KGB had discovered a technical vulnerability. Perhaps one source had led to another. Perhaps there had been tradecraft failures in Moscow. All of those things were more psychologically tolerable than the truth. Because a mole inside the agency meant the rot was internal. It meant every cleared officer became a possible suspect. It meant the enemy had not merely defeated American operations, it had been invited into their bloodstream. By late 1986, a team began the painful work of examining the disaster. Among those who would later become central in the mole hunt were Jean Vertefeuille and Sandy Grimes, names that deserve quiet respect in any honest retelling of this story. They were not chasing glamour. They were doing the slow, punishing, thankless work of counterintelligence, which often consists less of brilliant intuition than of endurance. You sit with files. You compare timelines. You test ugly hypotheses. You begin to suspect colleagues. You continue, even when the institution resists the implication of your own conclusions. That work was emotionally corrosive. Imagine the mood in Langley. Fluorescent hallways, closed office doors, a colleague speaking too carefully, another seeming suddenly over-friendly, every unexplained loss abroad turning into a question mark at home. Counterintelligence is the art of distrusting appearances, and when a mole hunt begins in earnest, the effect on an institution can feel almost spiritual, as if certainty itself has been contaminated. And yet, Ames carried on. That is part of what makes his story so chilling. He was not a mastermind in the romantic sense. He was a functioning bureaucrat living a double existence, going to work, attending meetings, reading cables, filing reports, and then serving a hostile power with information that ruined lives. His ordinariness was his camouflage. He did not need the theatrical brilliance of fiction. He only needed the protective coloration of a trusted insider. His meetings with the Soviets, and later the Russians, followed the rituals of clandestine work, but always with the grotesque inversion that he was a CIA officer using the logic of espionage against his own service. Every element of the craft, concealment, timing, signal, compartmentation, became an insult. He was not only stealing secrets, he was desecrating the profession he claimed to belong to. At home, the money began to alter the texture of his life. There was a house in Arlington, Virginia. There was an expensive Jaguar. There were indications of wealth far beyond what a CIA salary could sustain. In better circumstances, such things would have lit the sky with warning. But the late Cold War and immediate post-Cold War years were filled with their own illusions. The Berlin Wall fell in November 1989. The Soviet Union itself would collapse in December 1991. Across America, many people wanted to believe the old emergency was ending. The worst was over. History had taken its turn. The enemy had weakened. But listeners, this is one of the bitterest ironies in the Ames story. Even as the Cold War appeared to die in public, the hidden wounds it had inflicted were still bleeding in secret. An empire can fall, and yet the men it ran, the files it held, the penetrations it treasured, the executions it ordered, all of that can continue casting its shadow long after television cameras have moved on. Inside the CIA, new Soviet and then Russian operations had to be reconsidered. Recruitment against Moscow became more difficult, nearly paralyzed at moments by fear that any new source might soon be burned. Officers hesitated. Confidence collapsed. Some of the most valuable human intelligence the United States possessed against the Soviet target had been gutted. The damage was not measured only in names lost. It was measured in strategic blindness. This is where the story becomes more than one traitor and one service. It becomes a study in institutional vulnerability. What really breaks an intelligence service is not merely the theft of documents. It is the destruction of trust in the system's ability to protect its own assets and judge its own people. Once that trust is cracked, every operation carries a second layer of dread. There were warning signs around Ames, and some colleagues did notice pieces of them. His spending, his evasiveness, the mismatch between salary and lifestyle, the peculiar elasticity of his explanations. But intelligence services, like all bureaucracies, can be seduced by familiarity. A known man is often assumed safe simply because he is known. It takes moral courage to say, with evidence still incomplete, that the traitor may be one of us. As the years moved from the late 1980s toward the early 1990s, the mole hunt deepened. Not smoothly, not heroically in the cinematic style. It moved through frustration, wrong turns, institutional friction, and the grinding tedium of analysis. By 1990, the conviction that there had to be a mole had hardened. Too many operations had collapsed. Too many losses aligned too precisely. Yet knowing a traitor exists is not the same as finding him. The suspect pool can remain maddeningly broad. Access lists overlap. Memory is imperfect. Records are incomplete. Rival theories compete. Every delay costs lives, capabilities, and confidence. Jeanne Vertefeuille and her colleagues persisted. They looked for patterns, not personalities. They asked who had access to what and when. They compared vanished assets with internal knowledge. They resisted the natural temptation to settle on a comforting explanation too early. In espionage history, that kind of persistence is rarely celebrated the way betrayals are. But it should be. Counterintelligence is often the work of people who rescue institutions from illusions they desperately want to keep. Ames, however, still had one enormous advantage. He understood the American side. He knew how case officers thought. He knew how bureaucratic attention drifted. He knew that if losses could be attributed to technical compromise, sloppy tradecraft, or bad luck, the hunt for an internal traitor would move more slowly. He did not need to outsmart everyone. He only needed the system to remain divided against its own worst conclusion. There is also the intimate cruelty of his position. He sat inside the very machinery trying to comprehend the catastrophe he had caused. He could observe confusion from the first row. He could watch honest officers wrestle with the disappearance of sources he himself had condemned. That kind of duplicity takes a special moral emptiness. It is not merely deceit. It is a sustained participation in the grief of others while knowing you authored it. By August 1992, the hunt moved closer to him. Sandy Grimes discovered a pattern that now looks devastatingly clear. Ames had made large deposits after meetings with a particular Soviet official. Money, at last, began to tether suspicion to chronology. This was the kind of breakthrough that counterintelligence teams dream of and fear at once, because once the pattern emerges, the rest of the story begins to rearrange itself around it. Now imagine the emotional force of that discovery. Years of dead ends, doubt, and institutional hesitation, and suddenly a hard line appears in the fog. Bank records, timing, contact, a lifestyle built on lies. The theory of a mole is no longer theory. It begins to assume a face. Yet even then, caution was essential. The stakes were too high for a premature move. If Ames became aware of the tightening net, he might warn Moscow. He might flee. He might destroy evidence. The hunt therefore shifted into a more dangerous phase, the phase where suspicion must become proof, while the suspect still breathes free air. The FBI became deeply involved, and the investigation broadened into surveillance, technical collection, and evidence building. But before that final phase, there was a dreadful transitional period. A period in which Ames still walked, still worked, still carried secrets, while the people closing in on him had to continue pretending that ordinary life remained ordinary. That, listeners, is one of the most unbearable features of real espionage. The world does not pause for revelation. The man you now suspect of catastrophic betrayal may still be driving to work on the George Washington Parkway, still joking in hallways, still buying groceries, still sleeping under a warm roof, while the ghosts of ruined networks gather silently behind him. And what of the sources already lost? What of the names handed over in 1985 and after? Some of the damage could never be undone. Dmitry Polyakov, one of the most valuable Soviet military sources the United States ever had, would be executed after being compromised. Others met similar fates, or disappeared into the sealed darkness of Soviet retaliation. Each name represented not only intelligence value, but a human world, families, friendships, private hopes. The decision to help the United States had not been an abstraction for them. It had been a wager with death. This is the point where I want you to picture Washington in winter. Not the ceremonial city of monuments and speeches, but the quieter capital of parked sedans, office towers, gray skies, and officials carrying briefcases through the cold. Somewhere in that landscape, Ames kept moving. The Cold War had formally begun to recede. The Soviet Union had collapsed in 1991. The KGB had given way to successors, including the SVR for foreign intelligence. Newspapers were turning toward the New World Order, but inside the hidden war, the old reckoning had not ended. It was in this strange aftermath, when so many believed the age of existential espionage had passed, that the most intimate American betrayal of that era was being carefully, painfully exposed. There is a lesson there that history repeats with almost cruel patience. Nations are often most vulnerable not when danger looks largest, but when fatigue persuades them that vigilance can be softened. Ames had begun his treason in the last hard years of the Cold War, but he survived into the era of false exhale, when collapse abroad distracted from rot at home. By 1993, surveillance would intensify. But before we step fully into that tightening circle, consider the psychological battlefield from Ames's point of view. Did he feel fear every morning, or had routine numbed him? Did he begin to believe his own luck was actually skill? Did he imagine himself too familiar to be seen clearly? Traders often oscillate between panic and grandiosity. 1 hour they fear every knock at the door. The next, they begin to mistake institutional delay for personal genius. Perhaps Ames sat in his car and felt the first cold intuition that the geometry around him was changing. Perhaps he noticed nothing. Sometimes the most consequential men in history are not the most perceptive. They are simply the ones who remain undetected long enough to be lethal. The investigators, on the other hand, were now living inside a very different pressure. They had to move slowly enough to secure the case, and fast enough to stop further damage. Every day of caution risked another compromise. Every day of haste risked failure. That is the do-or-die arithmetic of counterintelligence. You hunt a traitor not in the clean language of certainty, but in the unstable territory between suspicion and proof. And above all of this hung a terrible possibility. If Aldrich Ames truly was the mole, then the damage already known might only be part of the story. There could be more names, more files, more operations burned, more allies misled, more years of blindness. The investigators were not merely closing in on a criminal. They were opening the door to a chamber of institutional shame whose full dimensions were still unknown. That is where we must leave them for now. Not at the arrest. Not at the confession. Not yet. We leave them in the tense, airless interval when the hunter finally sees the shape in the dark but has not yet touched it. Ames is still moving through Washington. The CIA still carries the wound without fully knowing its depth. The FBI is drawing nearer. And somewhere in the silence between office walls and surveillance logs, one question is hardening into certainty. What if the man helping investigate the wreckage has been the architect of it all? By 1993, the circle around Aldrich Ames had begun to close so tightly that ordinary life itself became a kind of performance. The investigators who had spent years sifting through wreckage were no longer working with instinct alone. They had timelines, they had financial clues, they had the uncomfortable, electrifying feeling that the invisible shape haunting the agency's Soviet disaster was finally becoming a man with a home address, a car, a desk, and a daily route to work. For Ames, these were the months when betrayal must have acquired a different texture. Treason is one thing when it feels like profit. It is another when the walls begin to move. Somewhere between the bank records, the surveillance reports, and the reassembled chronology of meetings, the invisible protection he had enjoyed for so long was thinning. Not gone, not yet, but thinning. The FBI and the CIA, after years of friction and delayed clarity, had entered the final stretch together. That mattered. It mattered because the hunt for a mole inside American intelligence is not just a criminal inquiry. It is an exercise in institutional humility. To catch a man like Ames, the system had to admit that its own assumptions had failed, that money had spoken louder than loyalty, that appearances had been trusted far too long. So surveillance deepened. Vehicles watched him. Investigators tracked movement. Garbage was examined. Signals were studied. The small outward gestures of clandestine contact, meaningless to ordinary neighbors, began to form a language. In October 1993, one of the old spycraft rituals, a signal mark placed on a mailbox, helped confirm that Ames was still operating. There is something almost grotesque about that image. Not a grand betrayal in a palace or a midnight exchange on a bridge, but a chalk mark in suburban America. A traitor carrying on his hidden life amid lawns, driveways, and routine. And then came Bogota, Colombia, in November 1993. That trip sharpened the danger. Investigators observed enough to deepen their confidence that this was not an old betrayal gone dormant. It was active. The stream had not dried up. Ames was still feeding secrets into hostile hands. Whether those hands were still called KGB in memory or were now working through post-Soviet Russian intelligence, the essential fact remained the same. The betrayal had outlived the Soviet Union itself. That is one of the darkest ironies in the case. The Berlin Wall had fallen in 1989. The Soviet flag had come down over the Kremlin in December 1991. Whole generations were being told that the old Cold War had ended. Yet Ames continued carrying its poison forward, as if history's public funeral had not reached the private rooms where damage is done. The Empire had changed names. The dead he had delivered to it had not returned. By the start of 1994, the investigators knew they could not let the case drift any longer. Ames was scheduled for travel to Moscow. That single fact gave urgency a harder edge. A suspected mole with years of experience, approaching the capital of the very power he had served in secret, could not be indulged with endless patience. If he fled, the full truth might vanish behind another state's protection. If he sensed the net and moved first, a decade of pain could end not in justice, but in escape. So February 21st, 1994, arrived with the peculiar stillness that often surrounds decisive moments. Not thunder, not spectacle, just an American morning in Arlington, Virginia. Cold air, a driveway, a man leaving for work. That was where it ended, or rather, where one hidden life ended and another began. FBI agents moved in and arrested Aldrich Ames outside his home as he was heading towards CIA headquarters in Langley. Imagine that instant from every angle. For the agents, years of uncertainty collapsing into action. The body finally caught, after the shadow had dominated room after room. For the agency, a wound given a face. For Ames, perhaps the sudden sickening recognition that luck had not been skill after all, that the bureaucracy he had manipulated and despised had at last assembled enough of itself to crush him. And for history, the grim punctuation of one of the most damaging betrayals in American intelligence. At the moment of arrest, he reportedly protested that they had the wrong man. But such lines belonged to a certain exhausted theater of espionage. By then, the evidence was too extensive, the financial records too stark, the surveillance too patient, the chronology too damning. His wife, Rosario, was also arrested. The hidden life, with all its expensive surfaces and carefully managed excuses, had been opened. The next day, February 22nd, 1994, formal charges followed in the Eastern District of Virginia. The names on the paper were severe enough: conspiracy to commit espionage, tax violations, the legal language that tries to convert moral catastrophe into prosecutable structure. But anyone who had lived through the losses of the 1980s knew that the real indictment was written elsewhere, in vanished sources, in ruined operations, in the fear that had spread through the CIA's Soviet effort, like an infection. This was the phase when the public learned enough to be shocked, but not nearly enough to feel the full weight of what had happened. The headlines could say, spy, mole, Soviet agent, betrayal. The headlines could mention money. They could mention a lifestyle impossible on a government salary. They could describe the dramatic fact that a senior CIA officer had served Moscow from inside the American system. But what headlines could never fully carry was the inner landscape of the damage. Because the real story was not only in the act of arrest, it was in the years that came before it. Men who had trusted the Americans had been taken. Some had been executed. Others had disappeared into prisons, interrogations, and official silence. Tradecraft that had taken years to refine had been rendered useless. Officers who had spent careers building fragile human bridges into the Soviet world had been forced to ask themselves whether the bridges had collapsed because of them, because of technology, or because someone in their own service had sold the map. Now, as Ames began to face the weight of evidence, the government wanted more than conviction. It wanted answers. Counterintelligence cases do not end with handcuffs. In some ways, that is when the deeper torment begins. Once a mole is caught, investigators must open the vault of betrayal and inventory the dead. Which names were passed? Which operations were burned? Which files were copied? Which services were warned? Which suspicions had been manufactured? Which men were lost because one traitor had pointed and another government had acted? Ames eventually entered a plea. On April 28, 1994, he and Rosario pleaded guilty. He accepted responsibility for espionage and tax offenses. She admitted to lesser charges related to the conspiracy and concealment. There is always something coldly transactional about plea agreements in espionage cases. The state wants truth, or as much of it as can still be extracted. The accused wants to save something, often a spouse, sometimes a child. Sometimes only a fragment of pride. In Ames's case, one motive for cooperation was clear. He wanted leniency for Rosario. What a terrible human picture that makes. A man capable of condemning foreign sources, men who had trusted him without ever meeting him, suddenly discovering tenderness, or at least urgency, when punishment approached his own household. History is full of this contradiction. Betrayers who speak easily of national abstractions become very attentive to family when the prison door swings open for them. The sentence was life without parole, no future release, no dramatic return to public life, no final bargain with memory. He would spend the rest of his days in prison. Rosario would later receive a sentence of 63 months in October 1994. Their son would grow up under the long shadow of a father whose name had become synonymous with institutional treachery. And there, listeners, is one of the cruel expansions of every espionage crime. The blast radius is never limited to classified files. It enters the family. It enters the child who must one day understand what the parent was. It enters the relatives who become custodians not of honor, but of aftermath. But even after the plea, the deeper work remained. Debriefing a spy is like opening a sealed room where the air has been bad for years. Each answer raises new questions. Each admission creates new grief. Ames described what he had done. He detailed the compromises. He laid out names and methods and the flow of money. Yet even then, not everything could be restored. You can identify the point at which a source was betrayed. You cannot resurrect his final hours. You can learn the sequence of a compromise. You cannot restore the years of strategic blindness that followed. Among the most tragic of those losses was Dmitry Polyakov, one of the most valuable Soviet military intelligence sources ever run by the United States. A major general in the GRU, Polyakov had for years provided an astonishingly rich picture of Soviet military and political realities. He was not a rumor merchant. He was one of those rare sources whose reporting can quietly reshape the understanding of an entire adversary. Executed in 1988, he stands as one of the most devastating symbols of what Ames destroyed. There were others, too. Intelligence history preserves some names and loses others inside classification, dispute, or incomplete records. But the broad truth has never really been in doubt. Ames's betrayal led to the compromise of a remarkable number of Soviet and Eastern Bloc sources and operations. At least 10 people are believed to have been executed. Many more were imprisoned, neutralized, or rendered unusable. Do not let the number become abstract. 10 is not an accounting category. 10 is a row of lives. 10 private worlds abruptly cut off. Imagine those final reckonings. A source in Moscow called in unexpectedly for questioning. The corridor too quiet. The office door closing with too much finality. Another man realizing, too late, that the surveillance outside his apartment is no longer routine. An interrogator placing a file on a table, not thick, not theatrical, just enough paper to prove that the state now knows. Then the slow, crushing machinery begins, not always with fists, sometimes with fatigue, sometimes with accusation, sometimes with the names of family members spoken in a low voice. The Soviet system did not need to hurry. It knew how to make time itself part of punishment. And all the while, the origin of that collapse was sitting in Washington, drawing salary, making excuses, buying better things for himself. That is why the Ames case leaves such a taste of moral disgust, even decades later. Some traitors can at least hide behind ideology, however warped. Some can say they believed one empire deserved to win over another. Ames was much smaller than that. His motives, by all serious accounts, were painfully ordinary. Money, resentment, vanity, personal failure. He did not sell secrets because he believed history required it. He sold them because he believed he was entitled to a different life. There is a passage in almost every great espionage disaster when the institution involved must look not only at the traitor, but at the mirror. For the CIA and the FBI, the Ames case demanded that reckoning. How had a man with glaring financial anomalies, questionable performance, heavy drinking, and increasing signs of lifestyle inflation been allowed to continue? How had warning signs been normalized? How had internal rivalry, procedural weakness, and the natural human reluctance to suspect one's own delayed the conclusion for so long? The answers were painful because they were systemic. Ames had not merely exploited a single loophole. He had navigated a culture in which compartmentation was imperfect, financial scrutiny was weak, and counterintelligence discipline had softened in key places. Polygraphs had not saved the agency. Routine personnel evaluation had not exposed him. Familiarity had dulled suspicion. In the years after the case, reforms followed, not because reform could erase the damage, but because the alternative was to accept that the system might someday create another Ames. This is where the story widens again. The damage from a mole is not simply operational, it is philosophical. Intelligence services rely on secrecy, but secrecy itself can become a narcotic. It can tempt institutions into believing that what is hidden is therefore controlled. Ames proved the opposite. A service can hide oceans of information and still fail at the simplest question of all. Who among us can be trusted? And that failure has consequences far beyond one arrest. After Ames, recruitment operations against Russian targets became shadowed by deeper caution. Handling sensitive assets required more rigorous internal skepticism. Information sharing among agencies changed. Financial disclosure and internal security review acquired greater urgency. The profession had been taught, in blood and humiliation, that the gravest threat might not come from the obvious enemy outside the gate, but from the disillusioned insider already holding the keys. There was another consequence, quieter but no less real. Officers who had lived through the mole hunt carried scars of suspicion. When a traitor is found inside an intelligence service, relief does not arrive cleanly. Yes, the guilty man has been identified. Yes, the bleeding may stop. But trust does not spring back to life on command. Careers had been warped by doubt. Friendships had been stained by internal suspicion. Some officers had spent years wondering whether they themselves had made a fatal mistake in handling a source, only to learn later that a colleague had sold the man instead. That realization can bring vindication, but not peace. And what of Ames himself after the sentence? Prison strips away the illusions that men like him build around themselves. No more secret meetings. No more coded signals. No more expensive purchases designed to tell the world that fortune has smiled at last. Only routine, confinement, memory, and the thin, cold company of one's own rationalizations. I often think that the most fitting punishment for certain traitors is not merely incarceration. It is the gradual loss of narrative control. While they are active, they tell themselves stories. That they are smarter than everyone else. That they are compensating for unfairness. That they are not really hurting anyone they know. That systems deserve to be manipulated. But history is less kind than self-justification. History flattens those stories and leaves what remains. A name, a record, a row of consequences. Ames may have tried at times to sound reflective, even remorseful. But remorse in espionage cases has limits. It arrives too late for the dead. It does not reopen the cells. It does not restore networks. It does not give back the years in which American intelligence against Moscow moved half blind because one of its own had sold the lamps. There is also the larger symbolic wound. The CIA, for all its myth and machinery, had long cultivated an image of elite professionalism in the clandestine struggle against the Soviet Union. Ames struck at the heart of that image. He proved that access can coexist with mediocrity, that betrayal can wear the face of routine, and that the greatest institutional vulnerabilities are sometimes the least dramatic ones. Not brilliance, but complacency. Not ideological fire, but appetite. In the years that followed, the Ames case would inevitably be compared with other betrayals, including that of FBI agent Robert Hanssen. Such comparisons are understandable, but Ames remains singular in one crucial way. The damage he inflicted landed at a moment when the Cold War's hidden balance still depended heavily on fragile human penetrations inside the Soviet system. He did not merely leak. He amputated. He cut away some of the most precious access the United States had built over decades. That is why the phrase, nearly broke American intelligence, does not feel like exaggeration. It feels like a grim summary. Because breaking an intelligence service does not always mean destroying its buildings or exposing all its methods. Sometimes it means leaving it unable to trust its own judgments, uncertain which disasters were caused by enemy skill and which by domestic treason. Sometimes it means forcing case officers to look at every future source through the ghost of a past betrayal. Sometimes it means teaching a bureaucracy to fear its own reflection. Yet history does not end with the traitor alone. It also remembers the hunters. The officers and investigators who refuse to let the mystery settle into permanent fog. Jean Vertefeuille, Sandy Grimes. The FBI teams who built the surveillance and evidence. The analysts who kept comparing dates and deposits and access lists until the impossible became undeniable. Their work did not resurrect the lost, but it restored one essential thing. It proved that truth, though delayed, had not been murdered entirely. There is dignity in that, not triumph. This is not a triumphant story. Too much had already been destroyed for triumph. But dignity, yes. The dignity of patient, unspectacular persistence. The dignity of refusing to let betrayal become just another classified tragedy filed away and half forgotten. The dignity of naming the wound correctly at last. And now, listeners, step back one final time and look at the whole arc. A boy, shaped in part by the world of intelligence, grows into a CIA officer. He moves through Ankara, New York, Mexico City, Langley, and the bureaucratic bloodstream of the Cold War. He acquires access, disappointments, appetites, and debts. In April 1985, he chooses money over duty and walks into the arms of the KGB. Across the next years, men in Moscow and beyond are arrested, executed, erased. In Washington, suspicion thickens into obsession. Files multiply. Trust decays. Then, after the Soviet Union itself collapses, the hidden criminality of the old era is finally dragged into the light on a winter morning in Arlington in 1994. What is the enduring lesson? It is not simply that treason is possible. Every generation knows that. The deeper lesson is that free societies, precisely because they rely on trust, are forever vulnerable to those who can mimic loyalty while feeding on secrecy. Institutions built to guard the Republic can be injured from within by vanity as surely as by ideology. No badge, no clearance, no title, no corridor of prestige is proof against moral emptiness. There is another lesson as well, one more somber and perhaps more humane. Intelligence history is often told through the names of famous traitors, because betrayal is easy to dramatize. But the true moral center belongs elsewhere. It belongs to the sources who risked everything in silence. To the men inside the Soviet apparatus who passed information because they believed some larger truth mattered more than fear. To the investigators who spent years untangling the wreckage. To the families who paid for secrets they never handled. To all those who carried the burden of a hidden war without ever becoming household names. Aldrich Ames wanted money, comfort, and the illusion of superiority. What he bought instead was a permanent place among the most despised figures in the annals of American intelligence. He became a warning carved into institutional memory, a reminder that the enemy outside may be formidable, but the enemy inside can be catastrophic. And when we speak of him now, we should do so not with fascination, but with clarity. He was not a dark genius. He was not a romantic anti-hero. He was a betrayer of trust on an immense scale, a man whose choices helped send brave people to their deaths and left his own service reeling. The coldness of that fact is enough. It needs no embellishment. Somewhere, in the imagination at least, the winter streets of Moscow are still there. The cautious footsteps, the gloved hand at a dead drop, the window watched from the far side of the road, the silent prayers of men who know that discovery means oblivion. Those are the true shadows of this story, not the comfort Ames purchased in Arlington, not the expensive surfaces he wrapped around his insecurity, but the hidden lives he extinguished, and the trust he nearly shattered beyond repair. Our story ends here for today. Thank you for listening. If you found value in this journey into the past, please share this story, leave a like, and subscribe. Until next time, stay safe, and remember, history is often made in the shadows.